Hello there folks, welcome back to the Chap's Guide. My name is Ash and I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. And today, well, I'm going to delve into a subject that I enjoy talking about, a certain fictional character who kind of leads the sartorial world for us intentionally well-dressed men. And it's on the back of a question which I received from a patron of mine called Kay. And he asked me this question. I know you like James Bond a lot. The character wears great suits, great ties. I especially like the ones that Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig wore in their movies. If you had the chance to pick up your top 3 ties from any of the James Bond movies, which one would you choose? Well, what a great question. And I have to admit, whilst I've been a fan of Bond as long as I can recall, certainly since I was a young child, and my dad first took me to the cinema to watch the double bill of The Man with the Golden Gun and Live and Let Die, I was kind of hooked. And in my early years, it was nothing to do with the sartorial elements of Bond. It was the action and the charisma that this man portrayed on screen. He was a gentleman, but still able to, take part in the action. He was ruthless and brutal. The steel fist in a velvet glove, so to speak. So when Kay asked me this question, it kind of dropped me into a world of wanting to know more about the ties which Bond had worn. And funny enough, there's a lot of resource online. I found one site called Bond Suits, in which they had thoughtfully curated a graphic of all of the ties worn by James Bond from the very beginning, Dr. No, right up to the Spectre movie, so not including the most recent Bond movies, but to see them all together, there were some facts which actually bring to mind. You notice some things. First of all of the ties which were worn by Sean Connery when he portrayed the role of James Bond were all solid in colour. Now that's a lesson to learn, I think. There's a lot to be said for solid coloured ties. All of George Lazenby, the man who followed Sean Connery in the Bond role just for one movie on Her Majesty's Secret Service, they were all solid of colour too. George Lazenby is the only Bond who does not wear a solid black tie in any of the movies, or the movie which he was in. More than half of Roger Moore's ties are all one solid colour. So there's a theme here. Bond, traditional style, classic elegance, simple is best. And I'm kind of steering down that path myself. Roger Moore, incidentally, while we talk about Moore, who was in fact my Bond, in so much as when I first was introduced to the character, Roger Moore was Bond at the time. So when I think of Bond, my mind generally defers back to Roger Moore. Roger Moore was the only Bond who wore any form of striped ties, or club tie, or rep tie. So, very interesting. The striped tie, when I'm thinking of the 80s and 90s, it kind of was king. And that was a period, of course, that Roger Moore was most active. Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan are the only 2 Bond characters who wore boldly patterned ties. Now, the majority of the other Bonds, subtle, classic, simple ties. Lessons to be learned. Every Bond actor who's played the role has worn at least one knitted tie. It's a theme which I keep coming back to when I see the Bond movies, the knitted tie. Certainly, Bond is a champion of that style of neckwear. And 3 James Bonds wear the black knitted tie that Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, in the books, he actually says Bond wears a black knitted tie. And 3 of the Bonds that we have seen in the role up to this point have all worn that black knitted tie whilst portraying the role. So they have been quite truthful to the Bond ethos. So I'm going to choose my 3 ties, which for me, I like the most. That I've taken this time, I've delved into the crevices of the Bond tie world. These are the 3 ties. And these are in no particular order, but I will tell you which one, if I could only have one, I would select at the end. So, Roger Moore, got to be one from his range. And Roger Moore's tie selection, which I'm picking here, is not glamorous, it's not spectacular. It has relevance though. It is the tie worn by Roger Moore in Live and Let Die, and it's quite a simple tie, seemingly a simple navy coloured tie with a small thin red and white stripe. But it's not simple. It is the tie of the Royal Navy. And this is very relevant to James Bond, because I'm sure you're aware, James Bond is a commander in the Royal Navy. Whilst he is an officer within MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service of the UK, he is actually a Royal Navy commander as well. And we don't really know how that all works. Is he on secondment, whatever? Never been sort of fully explored in the books. But 3 of the Bonds that we have seen or the characters, the actors who've portrayed Bond, have done so and have had the opportunity to wear that very glamorous, very fetching Royal Navy commander's uniform. First of all, we saw Sean Connery in the Royal Navy commander's uniform. Quite relevant, because Sean Connery actually served in the Royal Navy, although he was never an officer, so never a commander. But certainly, I think he carried off the uniform with that panther-like poise, which he's always credited with. Roger Moore was actually a commissioned officer, but in the British Army, and he wore the commander's uniform, as did Pierce Brosnan, who was a Bond who never served in any military service, but I think wearing the uniform, very flattering look, double-breasted reefer jacket with those gold buttons, and the 3 rings on the sleeve indicating the wearer is a commander in rank, and the single row of golden oak leaves across the cap, again denoting the rank of commander. So to see Roger Moore, that attention to detail, Roger Moore actually wearing the Royal Navy tie, I think is quite meaningful. I quite like it. It's quite, it's that fine-tuning of the attention to detail. The tie portrayed is a Royal Navy tie made by Benson and Clegg, which holds the royal warrant for ties, amongst other things. It's a tailor's based just off Jermyn Street in London. Benson and Clegg, famous manufacturer. You can buy that tie for £75 British. The problem would be that it's not something we can pull off, because unless you've served in the Royal Navy, it's really a big faux pas, a no-no, to wear a tie if you've no association to that military branch at all. You might get away with it if you're an American or you're in another part of the world, but here in the UK, if I was to wear a Royal Navy tie down the street, I would certainly invite comments from Royal Navy veterans, of whom there are, of course, hundreds of thousands in this country, who will ask me what ship was I on, and it would become a very awkward conversation. So it's something I can't do, but I particularly like that Royal Navy tie for its relevance. Now, we'll diverge just one moment before we talk about the next tie, because I want to talk about Daniel Craig, the most recent James Bond, who never got to wear a Royal Navy uniform in his 4 or 5 movies as James Bond. Bit of a shame, because it's kind of a rite of passage, I think, for the Bond actors. But he did get to wear a Royal Navy uniform just after he left the Bond character, because Daniel Craig actually was approached by the Royal Navy, and he has become an honorary commander in the actual Royal Navy. And there are images of Dan Craig wearing his Royal Navy commander's uniform. So actually, of all of the Bonds, he got to be a real commander, honorary of course, in the Royal Navy, whilst the others were only play acting, although Craig never actually got to wear the uniform in the movies. Another interesting fact, in the movies, you might have wondered how James Bond ever was recognised by his country for the numerous occasions that he's seemingly saved the world. What medals has he got? What awards did he ever get? Well, not Daniel Craig, but James Bond, in the movies and in the books, was recognised with a kind of lesser-known British national honour within the Order of St Michael and St George. Now, this is within the honours which are able to be given to citizens of the UK for their works and activities. The Order of St Michael and St George is not really well known, because it's generally an order which is specifically given to people who are diplomats, who work in the interests of the United Kingdom in an overseas area. So it's not really commonly handed out to people. However, because it's given out in that kind of niche area, it's often been used to recognise people who have been involved in clandestine services. All right, so yes, you might get it if you're an ambassador or a high commissioner, but it's also given to recognise spies, basically. And the fictional James Bond in the books, he was awarded the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. It's called the CMG. And it's quite a spectacular award. It's quite a beautiful award. It's there's different levels of the award, but the lower level, which James Bond is the CMG, and it's named for St. Michael. So St. Michael is the patron saint of military people and law enforcement officers. He's also the Archangel Michael, who was the general of God's armies who cast Beelzebub out of heaven and threw him into the fires of Hades, where he stays forever in the bowels of hell. So St. Michael is this big sort of warrior figure. And St. George is the patron saint of England. So St. Michael and St. George, quite relevant. Interestingly, and this is quite a coup, when Daniel Craig left the position of James Bond, very unusually for an ordinary citizen, he was granted the honour of being awarded the Companion of St. Michael and St. George. So in real life, he has come to mirror the character he played by being a commander in the Royal Navy and also being a CMG. Now, I'm sure that was all done a bit tongue-in-cheek. He received his CMG from Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, in an investiture at Windsor Castle, I think. So yeah, quite a claim to fame, that. Okay, let's get back on track with these ties. Now, the second tie I'm going to choose is seemingly a very plain one, but it's one which has been used to excellent effect by Bond in many of the movies, and it is the simple black knitted silk tie. And I think I've seen Connery wearing this, particularly in one of, if not my most famous Bond suit, and that's the three-piece light grey suit which he wore in Goldfinger, which he wore with a black knitted tie. Now you might think, black knitted tie, it is emblematic of funeral wear, generally. I mean, people don't tend to wear black ties on a daily basis because of that association with funerary sort of attire. But actually, when deployed with something a little different, so the knitted tie, I think, has the edge over a plain tie of any other material because it's got a sort of three-dimensional appearance. It's got that knitted texture, which I think takes away from the fact that it is a solid black colour. When you see Bond wearing it, certainly Sean Connery wearing it, I wouldn't say it's the star of the show. The suit certainly wins that battle, but it's a very good bridesmaid anyway to the outfit. I think it lends something quite special. I've always thought knitted ties lean more towards the casual because they're clearly not that formal, but when worn in situations, as Bond often wears them, sort of semi-formal, not necessarily, the most glamorous outfits, I think they work very well. I myself have something like 12 knitted ties in my collection. I'm wearing one today. I have a black one, but as I'm wearing a black jacket, I didn't want to wear a black tie because it would look as if I was going to a funeral. So I wore sort of emerald green colour. Just for the delineation of colours. But Bond often wears knitted ties, and I've seen all of the Bonds wearing them, as we know. Daniel Craig most recently wore it in, I think, pretty much every movie. So the knitted tie does add a little bit of texture. And if you want to go the Bond route, Turnbull and Asser make the silk knitted tie, which was worn by Bond, or three Bonds, I think it was. Connery certainly, and Dan Craig for sure, and I'm not sure which other ones. The knitted tie has been sort of a favourite thing of many style icons of the past, though. The Beatles, Paul Newman, very much favoured the knitted tie look. I think there's that slight hint towards sprezzatura, because it's not your typical bladed tie. They tend to have a blunt end to them, and they are generally quite slim in comparison to maybe a silken tie. So there is that slight thing going on. And also, the knots are very different. Because you've got this three-dimensional texture with a knitted tie, you can't really do a half Windsor, certainly couldn't do a Windsor. The four-in-hand is really the only route to go, and that is, within its very nature, an asymmetrical tie knot. So you're getting something a little bit sprezzatura going on there as well. So there's a lot of value to be added from the knitted tie. And as I say, Turnbull and Asser knitted tie worn by Bond would set you back 155 British pounds, slightly expensive when you consider the knitted tie's origins are actually with, you know, the ordinary poor people who were able to create knitted ties readily because, you know, it's not really expensive, or it was easily accessible then. The materials could be done in a home looming situation. So my final of the three I would choose is this one here. This is the Alexander Olch Avery tie, which was made, I believe, especially for No Time to Die, in which we see Daniel Craig wearing it on several occasions. And I know it's available in several different widths, so you can have wider or slimmer, wherever your personal choice is. Dan Craig chose to wear what I would describe as slightly a slimmer tie, maybe about 2.5 inch breadth. But it is, I would describe it as a silk tie. It's a handmade silk tie, made in New York, so it's an American-made tie. And it's a predominantly burgundy colour, which has some spots, silk-coloured spots in it as well. And I quite like the dark burgundy colour. I think that would make it incredibly flexible, because you can wear it quite easily with a white shirt, with a lighter blue shirt. It really opens the door a bit. And yeah, I've always been a fan of burgundy ties anyway, because when most men will typically be wearing a navy suit or a grey of some shade coloured suit, a bit of burgundy injects that necessary bit of elemental colour to a gentleman's outfit. And in this one, I like it because I could see myself wearing this tie a lot. Now, Alexander Olch is an American designer, author. I know he's got his fingers in many pies. This tie costs $150 US, which I think is quite approachable, considering it is a handmade, American-made tie in New York. So, very nice indeed. I do like that one. Now, before I give you my final choice of these three, which would be the one I would choose, I just want to give an honourable mention, because when I researched these ties, I noticed that most of them were rather bland, quite singular coloured, quite one-dimensional mostly. That's why I'm actually particularly attracted to the knitted ties, because there's a bit more going on there. But there's one Bond, well, two Bonds really, when you look at Moore and Brosnan, who had more colourful ties, but Brosnan particularly, a little bit modern, a bit more contemporary. He was Bond in the 90s, and he got to wear some nice ties. Now, pretty much all of his ties were provided by Turnbull and Asser, the world's best shirt maker down in Jermyn Street in London. And they hold the royal warrant for shirts for His Majesty the King, and they have produced ties for Bond for a very long time. And I looked at all of the ties which had been provided for Bond, and there was one which stood out to me as one which I would love to own and I could wear today. And it's still available from Turnbull and Asser, should you wish to go and buy this one. And it is this one. It is worn by Pierce Brosnan in The World Is Not Enough, and it's called the silk, or the square silk tie, and it is a sort of collage of different coloured squares with little dots as well, and it looks a bit chaotic, but actually there is geometric order to it when you look at it, and it works rather well, particularly when worn against a singular coloured, maybe a dark suit, either a navy suit or maybe even a charcoal grey suit, because it injects that little bit of colour, but there is an orderliness which is provided by the geometric semi-recurring pattern. Now that was created specifically for the movie in 1999. As Brosnan was drawing to the conclusion of his period in the role. And yeah, I just really liked that one. It resonated with me. Not enough for me to put it in my top three, but I'm certainly giving it an honourable mention. As I say, you could buy it today, £225 British pounds. Not cheap, but then again, handmade ties from Turnbull and Asser are not going to be cheap. So, finishing off, what is the one tie that I would choose if I could only pick one? It's going to be the Alexander Olch tie, because basically it's the one I think that if I owned it, I would be able to put it to the most use. I couldn't wear the Royal Navy tie. I've never served in the Royal Navy. I couldn't wear perhaps the black knitted tie quite so often because of its association with the funerary dress which many people will wear. But this Alexander Olch tie really does have quite flexible wearability, in my opinion. So there we go. So, Kay, I hope I've answered your question on my top 3 James Bond ties. Let me know what you would choose. Am I wrong? Am I right? Would you choose something different? Use the comments to let me know, or maybe even drop me an email. If you'd like to support the channel, you could buy me a coffee, one-off thing. You could even become a patron, like Kay, the person who asked this question today. And I answer questions like this every week for my patrons in a special video I make for them each and every week. If you'd like to get in on that, then the links to my Patreon page are all in the show notes below. So until the next time, wear your tie with pride and passion, and I will see you again very soon.